There comes a moment in a man's awakening when the familiar world begins to feel like a foreign country, not because anything has changed around him, but because something fundamental has shifted within him. He finds himself standing at the edge of conversations that once engaged him, observing interactions that once seemed meaningful, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he begins to step back. This is not withdrawal born of bitterness or disappointment. This is recognition. The recognition that what he once mistook for connection was often nothing more than mutual performance, an elaborate dance of validation, status-seeking, and the endless pursuit of external approval. Watch a man who is beginning to awaken, and you'll notice something curious. He doesn't suddenly announce his transformation. He doesn't make grand declarations about changing his life. Instead, something quieter happens. He simply stops pretending. He stops nodding along with conversations that feel empty. He stops laughing at jokes that aren't funny. He stops engaging in the subtle competitions that once seemed so important. And in that stopping, in that gentle refusal to participate in the collective illusion, distance begins to create itself. The people around him sense something has changed, though they cannot name it. Where once he reflected their values back to them like a mirror, now he stands, like still water, present, but no longer reactive. They find this unsettling because a man who is not seeking their approval is a man they cannot easily categorize or control. What they call distance is actually authenticity emerging. What they interpret as coldness is simply the absence of performance. He hasn't become less caring. He has become more honest. And true honesty creates space. Not the empty space of loneliness, but the fertile space of solitude. In our culture, we have been taught that connection equals constant engagement, that friendship requires constant maintenance, that love demands continuous performance. But the awakening man discovers something different. He learns that true connection cannot be manufactured through obligation or sustained through pretense. He begins to understand that most of what passes for relationship is actually a sophisticated form of mutual exploitation. I need you to validate my worldview. You need me to confirm your identity. I need you to laugh at my jokes. You need me to listen to your complaints. This isn't connection. It's a business transaction disguised as intimacy. Real connection, he discovers, is like water finding its own level. It happens naturally, without effort, without negotiation, when two people meet in truth rather than in need. And such meetings are rare because most people are still performing, still negotiating, still trying to get something from each other. So he learns to wait, not passively, but with the patience of a gardener who knows that some seeds take time to sprout. He would rather sit in honest solitude than participate in dishonest company. As the noise of constant social engagement fades, something else emerges. Silence. Not the empty silence that most people fear, but the pregnant silence that contains everything. In this silence, he begins to hear something he had forgotten, the sound of his own authentic voice. For years, perhaps decades, his inner voice had been drowned out by the chorus of external expectations, the voice that told him who he should be, what he should want, how he should think. But now, in the space that solitude provides, that authentic voice begins to speak again. At first, this can be uncomfortable. Many people avoid solitude precisely because they're afraid of what they might discover in the silence. They fill their days with noise, conversations, entertainment, work, anything to avoid the confrontation with their own inner reality. But the awakening man has learned something profound. He has learned that the silence is not empty. It is full of insight, full of peace, full of a kind of knowing that cannot be obtained through external sources. In solitude, he discovers not loneliness, but completeness. Here is the beautiful paradox that the awakening man encounters. The more independent he becomes, the more capable he becomes of genuine connection. When you no longer need others to complete you, you can finally appreciate them for who they are, rather than for what they can do for you. When you stop seeking validation, you can offer authentic presence. When you stop trying to be understood, you can truly listen. When you stop performing, you can finally be yourself. And in being yourself, you create the possibility for others to do the same. But this requires a kind of courage that most people are not prepared for. It requires the courage to be misunderstood, to be judged, to be alone when necessary. It requires the willingness to trade the comfort of belonging for the freedom of authenticity. Many people will interpret his independence as arrogance, his silence as judgment, his authenticity as rejection, but he understands that their interpretations say more about their own insecurities than about his intentions. He is not rejecting them. He is simply no longer adjusting himself to accommodate their discomfort. As his understanding deepens, he begins to see relationships not as possessions to be maintained, but as ecosystems to be honored. Some relationships, he discovers, can only survive in the artificial environment of mutual pretense. When that environment changes, when authenticity is introduced, these relationships naturally wither. This is not a failure. It is ecology. Just as certain plants can only grow in specific conditions, certain relationships can only exist within specific parameters. When those parameters change, the relationship changes. Sometimes it deepens, sometimes it ends. Both outcomes are natural and necessary. He learns not to mourn the relationships that cannot survive his growth. Instead, he honors what they gave him when they were alive, and he creates space for new kinds of connection to emerge. Connections based not on mutual need, but on mutual recognition, not on shared illusions, but on shared truth. These deeper connections are rarer, but they are also more nourishing. Like deep roots that can weather any storm, they provide a stability that surface connections never could. They require no maintenance, no performance, no negotiation. They simply are. In the space between who he was and who he is becoming, the awakening man discovers a companion he had forgotten. Silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of completeness. This silence teaches him things that no conversation ever could. It teaches him the difference between being alone and being lonely. It teaches him that solitude is not the absence of connection, but the presence of self. It teaches him that the most important relationship he will ever have is the relationship with his own authentic nature. In this silence, he finds a peace that does not depend on external circumstances, a joy that does not require external validation, a love that does not need an object. He discovers that everything he had been seeking outside of himself had been waiting inside of himself all along. This is perhaps the most radical discovery of all, that he does not need to be completed by another person, validated by society, or understood by the world. He is already whole. He always has been. He simply forgot, distracted by the noise and demands of a world that profits from his forgetting. Something beautiful happens when a man stops seeking approval and starts living authentically. He becomes a permission slip for others to do the same. Not through preaching or teaching, but simply through example. His presence becomes a reminder that another way of being is possible. Some people will be threatened by this reminder. They will try to pull him back into the old patterns, the familiar games, the comfortable illusions. But others will be inspired. They will see in his quiet confidence a possibility they had forgotten, the possibility of being themselves without apology. He becomes like a lighthouse, not chasing after ships in distress, but simply standing steady and bright, offering guidance to those who are ready to see. His solitude is not selfish, it is generous. By refusing to participate in the collective unconsciousness, he creates space for consciousness to emerge. This is how transformation spreads, not through argument or persuasion, but through demonstration. One awakened person living authentically creates ripples that can reach shores they will never see. Yes, there is a kind of loneliness that comes with awakening, but it is not the loneliness of the abandoned child or the rejected lover. It is the loneliness of the pioneer, the explorer, the one who has seen beyond the horizon and cannot pretend that the horizon is the end of the world. This loneliness is not empty. It is pregnant with possibility. It is not bitter. It is bittersweet. It carries within it both the sadness of what has been left behind and the anticipation of what lies ahead. He may look back sometimes at the comfortable illusions he has abandoned, the easy connections he has outgrown, the simple certainties he can no longer claim. There may be moments when he envies those who can still sleep peacefully in their dreams. But he knows he cannot unknow what he knows. He cannot unsee what he has seen. The only choice is forward, into greater authenticity, deeper truth, more complete solitude. Not the solitude of isolation, but the solitude of integration, the coming home to himself that makes all other homecomings possible. And so he walks alone, but not as an exile. He walks as an invitation. His very presence suggests that there is another way to live, another way to be, another way to relate. He is living proof that it is possible to be whole without being filled by others, without being completed by the world. To those who are ready, his solitude speaks louder than any words could. It says, "You too can stop pretending. You too can stop performing. You too can discover the difference between being liked and being known, between being popular and being authentic, between being busy and being alive." The awakening man does not choose solitude because he dislikes people. He chooses authenticity because he loves truth more than comfort. And in that choice, he discovers that solitude is not the absence of connection. It is the foundation upon which all genuine connection is built. In the end, he learns that the deepest loneliness is not being alone with yourself, but being surrounded by others while being unknown to yourself. And the greatest companionship is not being constantly entertained by others, but being genuinely comfortable in your own presence. This is the paradox and the promise of awakening, that in learning to be alone, you discover you are never truly alone. In learning to be yourself, you discover connection to everything. In embracing solitude, you find the source from which all genuine relationship flows. If this reflection resonates with something stirring within you, if you recognize yourself in this journey of awakening, consider joining our community of fellow travelers. Subscribe to Alan Watts Reflections, where we continue to explore these profound questions together, not as answers to be consumed, but as invitations to your own deeper understanding. The path of authenticity may be walked alone, but it need not be walked without company.